thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Daniel, notably for putting together this wonderful program. Now, my research in the last 10 years or so has been on the ontology of physics. So the contribution that I can make to this conference will be a very small field, and I won't touch the big issues. So what I want to convey to you are 3 claims, and the conclusion is a bit for propaganda, so I won't have to say much on free will. The first claim is that there's a clear reason to prefer physical theories with deterministic equations. So there's a clear reason to look for deterministic theory. Second claim, there's a clear way how to introduce probabilities in a deterministic theory, so how to account for what appears to be randomness, etc. And the third, and I guess this will be the controversial claim, is that there's no cogent reason to grant a basic ontological status to the dynamical parameters that enter the, let them be deterministic or not, equations of physics. And this is then the basis for saying physical determinism has no implications for free will. So what I will try to do in the next 40 minutes is just to remove some obstacles. So you may enter into the big issues, and my thesis then is that don't rely too much on physics. Physics won't solve these big issues. It will put some constraints, but it will leave the philosophical debate open. Okay? So now Professor Bergman should shut his eyes and ears, and Paul as well, because what I will do for the first 10 minutes will be a very, very rough answer to the question, what is physics about? And I think the answer is true, but I won't have the time to argue for it here now, okay? So start with Democritus. So physics is about what? It's about an infinite number of impenetrable atoms, and these atoms, they don't have qualities, they are indestructible, and they move in the void where they are distributed. But when they come close to each other or collide, their aggregation results in water and fire in a plant or in a human being. Okay, so now bracket the mind in a human body, right? Newton, at the end of the Optics, says, it seems probable to me that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, messy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. The changes of corporeal things are to be placed only in the various separations and new associations and motions of these permanent particles. And finally, 20th century Feynman at the beginning of the Feynman lectures. So even if you don't do physics, the best thing you could do is to read or try to read, or the Feynman lectures are the best textbook on physics. Okay, there he says, if in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence is passed on to the next generations of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? I believe it is the atomic hypothesis that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. In that one sentence, you will see there's an enormous amount of information about the world if just a little imagination and thinking are applied. So physics is atomism. It's about little particles. And why is this attractive? Because it has a great explanatory power. It's a proposal for an ontology of the natural world that is most parsimonious. So you just have one kind of objects. Things that are indivisible, so they are simple. It is most general because it covers everything in the natural world and explains the familiar macroscopic world. So you see the point is, in each of these quotations, the point is the explanatory power. So Feynman, see, just apply a little, you will see there's an enormous amount of, if you just apply a little imagination and thinking, you see you get, by the atomic hypothesis, an enormous amount of information about the world. Newton says, all changes, everything that happens is to be explained by the various separations and associations of these particles. And Democritus says that, so fire, water, etc., these are not primitive substances as Aristotle and others thought in the antiquity, but it is explained by the motion of these atoms. So the idea is that at the basic level of the physical world, you have indivisible point particles, and you explain everything by the way in which these particles are spatially distributed, and by the way in which that spatial distribution changes, by the motions. So you account for all the differences between macroscopic objects, so the difference between the chair, the body, the houses, etc., by reducing them to a configuration of particles, and by looking at the relative positions of these particles and how these positions change. Okay? And now I would like to introduce a little shop talk, but we need only two little philosophical shop talks. We need only two concepts. Call the atoms or the particles the primitive ontology, right? Why primitive? Because it's the ultimate referent of what we talk about. So you can ask a physical theory about what does it talk, about what it, or any theory whatsoever. What does it talk about? The last resort. It doesn't talk about mental states, although it uses, of course, propositions, representations. It refers to something out there in the world. What it refers to, what it accepts as unexplained, as simply being there, the ultimate referent, call this the primitive ontology. So the claim is that in physics, the primitive ontology are these little guys, these particles. Be a little bit more precise, call them points, meta points, because they are indivisible. And as was evident from the quotations before, the only thing we are interested in them are their relative positions, how they are situated relative to each other, and how this configuration, how this arrangement changes. Right. And now, of course, we want to know something about that change. How does it go such that this change is, sorry, I always have, I'm not happy, my free will would like me to revolt against all these being connected, etc. But I see that my free will is not respected, and that matter in this conference. Okay, and I can't bring about an intervention such that without all this chaos would happen. Okay, good. So we have something called the primitive ontology. That what, according to the theory, exists simply out there in the world. And we have a proposal for that. Now, we are interested so that the explanatory value of this position can be cashed out. Of course, we need an account of how the motion goes, how it comes about that when you change that configuration, you get something else. You get the building or human body, etc. How it comes about, what are the laws according to which this change of relative position happens. For that you need a geometry and you need some laws. Call this the dynamical structure of a theory. And it could be also the geometrical structure, but I think geometry and dynamics come in a package here. So call this the dynamical structure and put everything that is introduced through its function for the motion of the objects that ultimately exist in the dynamical structure. Okay? So exercise. You want to have fresh air, right? So there are two ways out of this room. One door there, one door there. Now I could throw balls to you, right? Say particle, you would say this goes through that door. That door we call primitive ontology, that door we call geometry and dynamical structure, mass. Mass goes through that door. Why? Because mass, for instance, is introduced in terms of what it does with the particles. As Ernst Mach pointed out against Newton, what is the definition of mass? The definition of mass can be inferred only from the motion of particles. So mass is what makes the particles attract, or what makes them resist certain forms of motion. And now we could do the exercise, and I guess if we do it, perhaps we both may agree, if you agree to that terminology, where goes what. So energy and the force go through that door, the particles and the distances go through that door, the absolute space, if there is an absolute Euclidean space, goes through that door, etc. So you see how the game goes. So the idea is that in the basic ontology, you have configurations. So this is just drawn there. I should say, but we can't say much about space and time, that for these purposes I'm a Leibnizian, so I think that Leibniz in his objections against Newton is completely right. Or the thing you need for physics are the distances, the relative positions. All you need is the ratio between these distances, so that that guy is farther away from that one than from that one. And then this suffices also to individuate these objects. So another of my hobbies is structural realism, so you get, but only in brackets, that's not the topic this afternoon, you get a structural individuation of these objects. The question whether they have an intrinsic nature is useless. Of course, they don't have an intrinsic nature because they are simple objects. Nonetheless, they are real existing objects. According to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, they are discernible in virtue of the spatial relations in which they stand. So here you have one point, call it your fixed star, with respect to which I can individuate all the other points. And now these change, that's everything, these change. You have a succession. Now we come to laws and to the disagreement about laws and succession. So you have a succession of these configurations. You have an order there in the sense that that succession is directed. So first you have to listen to the talks and then you get dinner. It cannot be the other way around. And that you don't have an absolute time here. You have an order in there, a partial order, according to such that this comes after that, etc. And then you can introduce time as a measure for that order. So again, Leibnizian issues. And again, I'm not obeying the rules.
No, I'm concurring with your will.
Okay. Oh, that's great. You concur with my will? But I won't make you agree with my claims, I guess. That's my will won't bring about. Okay, so just to underline, there's another quotation, Nat Hall, contemporary philosopher at Harvard. The primary aim of physics, its first order business as well, is to account for motions, or more generally for change of spatial configurations over things over time. Put another way, there's one fundamental why question for physics. Why are things located where they are, when they are? And in order to answer this question, physics can, of course, and I would say has, of course, to introduce new physical magnitudes, but they come in, so to speak, in the secondary place. So here's my scheme of a physical law, and we are back to the controversy with the previous talk. So what we put here on the left side is the configuration of particles we have in the universe, individuated by their relative distances. And what we want is to know how that configuration changes. So that's the fundamental why question for the change, is to account for the change of spatial configurations of things over time. So put this just on the left, on the right-hand side. So we want the velocity in the first place. The velocity is the first temporal derivative of position. So how does this change? And now we need something that fixes that velocity, that gives us a velocity field which tells us, or which fixes the velocity field, how the particles move in time. And if we only get the information about their relative position, we can't do this. Given the relative positions of you in this room right now, nothing can be inferred about how you will be seated at dinner. Right? So we need some more information. Suppose you were particles. Forget a minute about that. Your minds don't have free will, etc. So we have to answer the question, what fixes the velocity? And now we need further magnitudes, parameters, that are introduced in terms of their causal or functional role for the motion of the particles, and we need a geometry. To my mind, but that's another issue, the geometry comes in a package with the dynamics. You adapt both of them to each other. You want the geometry that gives you the right dynamics, etc. So then comes what goes through that other door: masses, charges, forces, fields, energy, spin, wave functions, etc. What have you. They make up the dynamical structure of a physical theory, right? So this, you need this fundamental division. So here would be my preferred way of writing down Newton's laws of gravitation just to illustrate the scheme. I want the force on a particular particle, and of course this depends on the position of all the other particles in the universe, and I can calculate it only pairwise. But this this does not matter. The take-home message is that the scheme of a law, what you want the law to tell you, is how the particle configuration develops. You want a law that tells you how it changes. And that law can only be a law that applies to the particle configuration as a whole. Because how something changes here may depend on what's going everywhere else in the universe. By definition, I would say, any fundamental physical law is a law that talks about the universe as a whole. And it's a law that answers the question, how does the configuration of matter develop in time? And there we are right at the topic of determinism. I want, of course, the law, that what fills in my scheme, that what determines my velocity, to be as simple as possible and to be as informationally rich as possible. So it should tell me for every possible situation, if I put in a certain configuration as the initial one, as the real one, how would that configuration develop? And I want to have only what I need for this. So the aim of a physical theory is to find a representation of the evolution of the particle configuration, just in brackets. If you don't like the word particle, put in whatever your candidate is for your favorite is for the fundamental, basic, primitive ontology of physics. So for the evolution of the particle configuration that achieves an optimal balance between richness and information about that evolution and being simple. And if it's too much simple, it may lose on the information side because it leaves out certain variables, may leave out certain forces. If it has too much informational content, it won't be simple. Then I could just draw my list of how the evolution goes, but I won't improve on. And that's the reason why physics prefers deterministic laws, because they achieve that optimum. They are such that if you have an initial configuration, or they are such, more generally speaking, say whatever your configuration may be, put in such a scheme, filled in there, they give you the entire evolution of the configuration. The question then only is whether it's right. So we know that Newton's law of gravitation is wrong. It's too easy because there are other factors than gravitation that influence the motion of the configuration of matter, and whether a further improvement in simplicity is possible. So if it's not empirically correct, it's out. And if it's empirically correct, can you make it more simple? If you have fundamental probabilistic laws, they always leave open the question whether they can be improved. The probabilistic laws tell you only possible histories of how this configuration can develop, but they won't tell you the actual history. And I will illustrate this in a minute with the only example we have for a probabilistic fundamental law, just to provoke perhaps the next speaker or someone. Well, this will go on, and all three speakers this afternoon will contradict each other. But it's hopefully what makes it a good discussion. Okay? Now, what we see here is determinism is a virtue of a theory in the first place. You have the evidence. You have your configuration of matter. You have how the objects move. What you want now is a law that covers that evidence in such a way that it covers as much as possible. So in the ideal case, all possible configuration of your matter, and covers them in such a way that it gives you the entire evolution, so that it answers the question if that, so the distribution of people on the chairs here, if that is the universe at a given time, how does that universe develop? Now that's in the first place, that's a virtue or a feature or a property of the theory. It's not a statement about the world. Nothing in here for the time, as far as I said, says anything about that there is something that literally, so sorry, if you move, that literally comes to you and pushes you, etc. You move. And now I have all the motion. Suppose I have a long list of how that motion goes. And now I want to have a simple law. That's what I take to be I mean, I will be contradicted by the real physicists, I guess, but I stand for this. That's what I take the business of physics to be. Now comes a big problem, because a universal physical theory would, of course, be useless. Why? Because you can never know the entire particle configuration. You know that you have to know the entire particle configuration to get a law. Because it would not be a law if it just talked about two objects and took for granted that all the other objects that are out there in the world play no role for the evolution of that configuration. That may be so unhappy situations. So in classical mechanics, you sometimes find happy situations. So if I throw an object such as a stone here on the earth, I can abstract from where all the other objects are. But that's a lucky case. In this case, I can directly apply my law, put in two objects, and calculate something. But that's the exception. If I throw a coin, right? They do the same thing now with a coin. They want to know whether the coin falls heads or tails. Then I'm hopeless here. I can't make any prediction. What will happen to this coin, right? In the individual case, I can say only it will either fall head or tails, and with the same probability, right? So a tiny variation here in the initial conditions, what exactly the initial position and initial velocity of the particles composing the coin changes the result entirely. And if you go from classical to quantum physics, that's the only thing that changes. But not the only, but that's the main point to get. In quantum physics, that's the generic situation. Tiny variation in initial conditions may change the whole result. Okay? So what I have to do now is to link the deterministic law with a probability measure that answers the question of how can I apply the law? How can I apply the law to subsystems of the universe, to particular systems that I can manipulate in a laboratory, in which I'm interested, right? So the question then is what? I don't know the initial conditions. It's hopeless. But the law, if it is to be applicable, has to give an answer to the question of, under ignorance of the exact initial conditions, what evolution of the system can I rationally or typically expect? So what evolution of the coin can I typically expect? Well, that if I throw enough coins, then there will be an equal distribution of heads and tails, etc. Okay, so we get there from classical to classical statistical mechanics, Boltzmann's achievement. I think he was here some Boltzmann-Gasse, I think, is somewhere in the vicinity here. So think of Boltzmann, right? And now the same thing applies. This is a controversial statement, but I won't have time to go into it. Exactly the same thing applies in quantum mechanics. The quantum probabilities are exactly like the classical probabilities. They follow from a deterministic law. And then you can have a debate now whether the Schrödinger equation on its own would be sufficient. There are good reasons to think that would not be sufficient, so you have to supplement it with something. And then Born's rule for the prediction of statistical distribution of experimental outcomes will follow from that. So the fact, put it the other way around, that the world appears to be random, right? You throw a coin and every single time there is some other result coming up, of course, does not imply that the world is indeterministic. The question then is, what is the theory? What is the law behind it? And for every known case in which something appears to be indeterministic, we have a deterministic law. And the issue then is, and again, that's a debatable issue, that the link between the law and the probability measure which answers that question has to be natural, so to speak. It must not be ad hoc. So in this case, it is not ad hoc. In this case, it is not ad hoc either, but the details would get us in another direction now. So it is this package. We have three elements now. We have an ontology, which tells us what there is in the world. We have a dynamical structure, which tells us how what there is in the world can be described in such a way that we can answer the question of, given an initial configuration, what would happen then. That, by definition, I would say, has to be universal, so it's not applicable. So that has to be linked with a probability measure that enables us to apply the theory. Now you could object, why don't we just stick with 3 with the probabilities and throw 2 and 1 out? That's what happens, that's what happens in physics these days often. That they just look at how to calculate statistical distributions of measurement outcomes, and then they tell you, well, that's all that physics is about, or that's all that's of interest or so. But that can't be right. In the first place, physics is about nature. And in the second place, of course, you want an answer to what happens in the individual process. And of course, if I throw a coin, right, there's a fact, even though I can make only statistical predictions, there's a fact of the matter, first, that the coin here and the coin on the floor is the same coin, and that there's some way in which the coin gets from here to there. It does not disappear in the meantime. It does not smear out over the whole universe in the meantime, to be so kind that when I pick it up, it still is in a precise location, etc. And this, again, that would be another talk, but I'll fight for that if need be in the discussion. Exactly the same applies in quantum physics. Quantum physics is a rational, realistic, physical theory like any other one. Once the dust of bad philosophy, which was explained by Professor Swinburne and Professor von Wachternach last night to us, once the dust of bad philosophy associated with a certain town located in the north of Germany is removed, then you get exactly the same as we had before. And these days it is removed, okay? So these were the first and the second claim. So the first claim was a clear reason to prefer deterministic theory. Yes, because you want the maximum of information as simple as possible. Second reason, clear way to introduce probabilities. Yes, they have to be linked with the law, because otherwise the law is useless for applications. But don't forget, when applying when focusing on these applications, that there is a theory of nature behind it, and an answer has to be given what happens in the individual case, although you can make only statistical predictions. Now, the third claim, the third and philosophical controversial claim, is that as far as the physics is concerned, we are happy, we better stick with the primitive ontology. And we better, and this is now philosophy, conceive our ontology in such a way that it's not the ontology of this or that theory, but it is independent of theory change as far as possible. Of course, there's no a priori here, there's no necessity here, there's no guarantee that when people will come up with a theory of quantum gravity, the ontology of particles changing their distance relation will stay true, etc. But I want a scientific realism that is robust, that is immune against arguments from pessimistic induction and underdetermination and whatsoever. So the claim is the primitive ontology that I've outlined stands firm for the whole of physics, from Democritus to Feynman's quantum field theory. What changes, of course, is the dynamical structure, how to represent the motion that factually happens. And the more you learn about the motion that factually happens, the better your theory gets, and the more you find out about astonishing motions. Quantum physics are astonishing motions and particles. But don't put this in your ontology. Don't put this, by ontology I mean now the basic ontology. So again, in philosophical chop talk, mass, fields, charges, wave functions, etc. supervene on the basic ontology, which means that given the basic ontology, given the change in the particle positions as a whole, the rest is fixed as well. So of course statements about wave functions, masses, fields, charges, etc., and what have you are true. But what makes them true is not that masses, charges, energies, wave functions in absolute space, Euclidean geometry, etc., sit out there in the world in the basic ontology. What makes it true is just the change of relative positions of these little guys, okay? And this is philosophically fine in the sense that it's a possible position. So I could spell this out further by using conceptual analysis. Conceptually, we had a discussion sometime over lunch, I think, whether conceptual analysis was on your bad list as well. And I said, no, it was not on your bad list because conceived in the Louis Jackson style, it's proper metaphysics, okay? So if we go into this, we find the tools. You have called the terms about particles, their relative positions and change of these positions, your old vocabulary, your basic vocabulary. Then you can introduce all the other terms you need in terms of their function, in terms of what they do with these basic entities. And then these basic entities can, of course, serve as truth makers for all the statements you get. So this is how this can be spelled out. Now, many people don't want it, and I did not want it for many years either. I thought you better have all this in your ontology, because if you have masses, charges, forces, fields, and whatever, in absolute space in your basic ontology, then apparently you get an answer to the question of why the particles move in the way they in fact do. But you don't. I mean, the answer is circular, because the reason is the one I already mentioned when quoting, or when paraphrasing Mach on mass. What is mass? Mass is, you can answer, so why do these objects fall down? Because they have a mass. What is their mass? Mass is what makes them fall down. Mass is what makes them behave as in the law of Newtonian gravitation, or whatever may be the final law of gravitation. So it's like Molière, so that's why I moved away from dispositions. It's like Molière on dispositions in Le Malade Imaginaire. So you have, why do people fall asleep when they consume opium? Well, because opium has the virtue of making them fall asleep. No explanation. You go down to basic parameters. Of course, they are sparse, etc. properties. No explanation either. You still turn in a circle. Same with absolute space. And even worse. So the claim is, by enriching your ontology of the physical world, you don't gain anything in explanation. So you better don't do it. So not only do you not gain anything in explanation, you get a drawback and you get into artificial problem. So if you think that a mass sits in this object here, the question is, how can it attract, how can it make move other objects across space, across empty space, right? How does a wave function, hot topic in the ontology of quantum physics now, how does the wave function influence the motion of matter? Those who are Eumenians about the wave function, I'm involved in this business, would say, well, that's not a good question. The wave function just is the parameter, okay? So you see, Newton was worried about this. Newton thought that action at a distance is so great an absurdity that no one who has any right sense can ever fall into it. But unfortunately, that's what his theory says. Given the particle positions of the church over there and whatever else, immediately at the same time, the force, how the particle here will accelerate, is fixed. But if you say this is just a parameter, the motion is just given, the objects move in the way they do. First come the phenomena, then come the laws. So they move in the way they do, and now you try to make a bookkeeping of that motion which is as simple and as rich in informational content, then you don't get into the trouble of answering such a question. You may think, and that's the usual objection you get then there, you may think, yeah, of course, Newton action at distance is silly, but fields solve the problem. Of course not. Fields don't solve any problem because you get into the physical trouble of self-interaction. So if you have Feynman on fields, if all charges contribute to a field, the field then acts back on the charges so that each charge must act back on itself. Theory breaks down, inconsistency. That's the mistake. There was no field, there's nothing spreading out there. Okay, so now I just let this electron act on that, etc., and then I just have particles and actual amount particles and bookkeeping variables. That's what Feynman says there. Okay, so third claim was you don't gain anything. Perhaps there are dispositions, he said, well, I don't know, I won't touch the big philosophical issues, I said, but just as far as the ontology of physics is concerned, it is of no help to introduce them in the ontological ground floor. It is a rather desperate move to think that laws are primitives in the ontology, as some people like Tim Maudlin and others think, etc. You don't need this. The ontology should just be as sparse as possible, because that's all you need to get the usual scientific explanations. And if you add something to the ontology of the physical world over relative particles' positions and their change, you will be punished by follow-up problems and follow-up questions that you cannot answer. And so you can enjoy your free will, right? There's no commitment. Of course, the world is deterministic in the sense that the laws represent the evolution of the particle configuration in a way that optimizes information and simplicity. And there are some candidates. You could, in quantum physics, you could run a law in which you add parameters of collapse of wave function to the Schrödinger equation. The people who do this seriously, if you ask them, do you think that this is a fundamental law? They would say, no, of course not. That's not a fundamental law. It's a phenomenological law. The fundamental law may, of course, be deterministic, because then we would have these virtues again. Okay? So there's a clear reason to prefer determinism and physics, but this does not imply a commitment to any metaphysical determination of motion. So the motion just happens, right? And then come the laws. And if you have what you have a mind which is a substance or so, and that intervenes in the physical world, then there should be a difference. Sorry to take up Ansgar Beckerwald's question. There should be a difference in the neural events, and that difference should be detectable. And if it is so, then you add a mind parameter to the mass parameter. And if God intervenes, you do the same. And if you don't see this, then perhaps it does not. It would infringe upon the simplicity, and it would not optimize the information. Then you don't do it. But whatever free will may be, just from the fact that it's a virtue of physical theories to be deterministic, nothing follows, because it does not follow anything about a sort of metaphysical determination. There is a thing that comes. That would be a very naive thinking, to think that there comes and pushes Thomas Zuckerb here if you move, because there's a heavy object over there. You see this already in Newton. You see this when you think through field theory, that would be naive. So there's no physical factor. Why think that metaphysically it does so? To my mind, again, it's the same as ontology, as putting masses and so on in your basic ontology. You only get into trouble. Avoid this trouble by not doing so. And if there were such a conflict, of course, and here I agree with Daniel, it would concern probabilistic laws in the same way as deterministic ones. Because, of course, the probabilities in physics are not up to me. If the probabilities push me in a certain direction, then I can't help it. Okay? So the take-home message is that for these big questions, physics leave everything open. So in a certain sense, I argued against scientism, in the sense that if people say so, of course, physics is deterministic, so you don't have free will, or your genes determine you, and we should no longer lock up murderers in prison or so. Of course not. There's nothing, as far as physics is concerned, nothing normative in nature, so nothing normative can come out of nature. It would be a naturalistic fallacy to think that out of statements about matters of fact, you could get statements out of norms. And I don't know much about free will, but I tend to think of free will of having to do something with rational choice, with responsibility, so with answering the question, how should I act? So it's not that I simply act out of a course, if that is so, but that I try to answer the question, what shall I do given certain circumstances? And this, of course, cannot be delegated to science. This has to be settled by us. So everything I said is compatible with naturalism. I don't have nothing in the naturalism. I mean, nothing. There's nothing in the ontology, the complete ontology, beyond the primitive ontology of physics. But nothing what I said is committed to naturalism. Science does not settle metaphysics. So for all of those who are engaged in philosophy of religion, etc., don't be bewitched by science, and don't do good philosophy. Develop good, cogent, philosophical arguments. But arguments of the type, science teaches us that determinism is true, therefore you cannot have free will, or science teaches us that, and then you put in a metaphysical conclusion there, you can put in a universal quantifier, they're all false. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Esfeld. For the response, I now invite to the front Ms Viktoria Kostadinova from the University of Düsseldorf.
Thank you for the inspiring presentation and for making your book manuscript available to me. I have to say that I like your view because I believe it can establish the coherence and empirical adequacy of the metaphysics of causal powers, which is widely believed to be paradoxical or mysterious, while our freedom of the will, I believe, can plausibly be understood in terms of a complex causal power. In the debate about free will, philosophers have famously focused on the implications of physical determinism for our freedom to do otherwise, and determinism.
Use the microphone a little bit more.
Sorry.
Understand.
Yeah. And so the physical determinism is a thesis about entailment relations between, on the one hand, the state of the world at some earlier time, all the laws of nature in the world, and on the other hand, the state of the world at some future time. And as you have said, this sense of determinism has to be distinguished from the so-called metaphysical determination in terms of providing the ontological grounds for or making true, etc., which is a model claim and involves some kind of necessity. And now, according to the Humean view of the world, determinism does not deprive us of our freedom because, on that view, the laws of nature are a subset of all the regularities in the world, including past, present, and future regularities. And as such, the laws of nature and the past do not determine only one physically possible course of events, but rather it's the other way around. So the laws of nature are partly determined or partly depend on or describe future regularities. And so even if the world is deterministic, we still have the ability to do otherwise than what we actually did. According to the libertarians, however, human free will requires more than just the presence of alternative possibilities in terms of could have acted otherwise. Freedom of the will, as opposed to mere freedom of action, requires deterministic powers or abilities to control or to determine the way one acts. And so it requires deterministic abilities as opposed to mere chance or mere possibility. And more importantly, alternative possibilities are not even necessary for such abilities, because there might be cases where only one possible course of action is rationally justified. And now your view, which is a version of a very moderate ontic structural realism, can account for this idea, I believe, in the following way. According to your superhuman view of the world, in contrast to the Humean mosaic, there are distance relations which individuate metal points or point particles, and in addition to that, there is change between those distance relations. And that is all. So there is no need to postulate any intrinsic categorical properties which are instantiated at space-time points, but rather there are only distance relations. But since causal powers are essentially relational properties, one might plausibly hold that the distance relations just are causal powers. And so it turns out that all else supervenes on causal powers, which are essentially dynamical properties or relational structures. And yeah. In conclusion, so I take it that the moderate version of ontic structural realism supports actually the metaphysics of powers, showing that it is compatible with science in general and with fundamental physics in particular, and by extension, the libertarian view of free will as a complex power is coherent and empirically adequate rather than mysterious and unscientific as is widely believed. So.
Thank you, Ms. Kostadinova. Professor Esfeld, would you like to give a brief response?
Yes, thank you in the first place for putting many things right, etc., about which I just glossed over. Just one point, I'm skeptical whether it is a good idea to think of distance relations as causal power. So in the first place, I don't see how to put this into the physics. So you may think of a mass as a power of attraction, but a distance relation just seems to be there for the simple reason that when I give you the distance relations here, now in this room, the information about the distance relations does not contain any information about their change. Now, Alexander Bird thinks that he can do something else with general relativity theory, but it would get us into... So there's a physical reservation. So I think, as a philosopher of science, I think that if you make a claim about the physical world, then you have to be able to cash it out how this exactly goes with the physical theories that we accept. I don't think that the physical theories are the guide to metaphysics, or they're not even the guide, or their mathematical structure is not the guide to ontology. But the other way around, if you make an ontological claim, please cash it out now in concrete terms how this fits with the physics. And thinking of distance relations as causal powers, I have reservations there. Then, of course, the question would be to discuss what's the exact view of power, if they have an intrinsic modality, etc. I think that's not the issue for physics, etc. So that would be a point of disagreement. So I thank you for building a bridge into libertarianism and into more metaphysically inclined views. But well, I'm not sure whether I should go over that bridge. Yeah.